My name is Michael Keller. I'm the university librarian, and on behalf of the university libraries and the Lane Center for the American West, thank you for spending some of your evening with us tonight. I have the honor to introduce my friends David and Leslie right now. I'm afraid that I could spend all of this evening speaking about each of them, but I'm going to be very brief so they have a lot more time with you. David is the Donald J. McLachlan Professor of History Emeritus here at Stanford. He's an American historian of the first rank and a Pulitzer Prize-winning author for his book, Freedom from Fear. His long devoted royalties to the Annie Nelson Bailey Memorial Book Fund in the university libraries, arising from the sale of The American Pageant and The American Spirit, textbooks he co-authored with Thomas Bailey. As chair of the Stanford Bookstore's board of directors during the time of its dissolution and prior to the license that was given to Follett to run what some of us now call a t-shirt store, David created a major library book fund from a portion of the sale funds. The book fund is devoted to filling in gaps as we discover them in the course of acquiring new scholars and new graduate students. I gave David the Warren Howell Award for distinguished contributions to the university's libraries in 2008. And I must tell you that whereas his diversion of royalties to the libraries is quite amazing and quite wonderful, as is the decision he made with regard to the funds from the bookstore, he has been an advisor and a stimulus to the libraries for his entire career, which is a very long career. Now, Leslie. Leslie is the historian of the long-standing Silicon Valley archives here in the libraries and has served in that position since she received her PhD from Stanford in 2001. David is her doctoral father. Troublemakers is her second book. The first is The Man Behind the Microchip, which is a biography of Robert Noyce, who co-founded Fairchild Semiconductor and Intel and co-invented the microchip. We are enormously proud of Leslie's work, and particularly for her two books. Now about the book. At a time when the 5 most valuable companies on the planet are high-tech firms, and nearly half of Americans say they cannot live without their cell phones. And this reminds me now to ask you all to put your cell phones on stun, okay? We're going to be live here tonight, not telecommuting. Troublemakers reveals the untold story of how we got to where we are now. This is the gripping tale of 7 exceptional men and women, pioneers of Silicon Valley in the 1970s and the early 1980s. Together, they worked across generations, industries, and companies to bring technology from Pentagon offices and university laboratories to the rest of us. In doing so, they changed the world, importantly. Here are the people and the stories behind the birth of the internet and the microprocessor, as well as Apple, Atari, Genentech, Xerox PARC, Roam, Ask, and the iconic venture capital firms Sequoia Capital and Kleiner Perkins Caulfield and Byers. In the space of only 7 years and 35 miles, a radius of 35 miles, 5 major industries, personal computing, video games, biotechnology, modern venture capital, and advanced semiconductor logic were born here. I'm going to read now 3 excerpts from critical reviews of Leslie's book, Troublemakers. The first is from Eric Schmidt, executive chairman of Alphabet, former CEO of Google, of course. I'm quoting now. Leslie Berlin is a master historian of Silicon Valley, and the publication of this book is a landmark event. Kaleidoscopic, ambitious, and brilliant, the book draws on a dazzling cast of characters to chart the rise of the 5 industries that have come to define technology today, and collectively to remake the world. The second, from Fortune magazine. Apple's late co-founder, Steve Jobs, liked to hang out with the older generation of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs because, he claimed, quote, "You can't really understand what is going on now unless you understand what came before." For the rest of us, Leslie Berlin's sweeping new history of the Valley is the next best thing, essential reading. The book does a masterful job explaining profound discoveries like recombinant DNA and microprocessors, while also keeping up a brisk narrative that's aided by accounts of naked hot tub meetings and pot-addled programmers. That's all a quote from Fortune, folks. Now, number 3, from the New York Times review last Friday by Jonathan Nee. It's only a couple of sentences from a very long and wonderful review. Miss Berlin does not whitewash the aspects of even the Valley's early years that foreshadow the more profound cultural issues to emerge in the industry's middle age, writing, quote, "It takes a certain kind of audacity to think you can launch a company, much less invent an industry, and audacity often veers into arrogance." Now, a little advertisement, actually 2. If you'd like to learn more about Stanford's Silicon Valley archives, join us in the libraries for an open house on Thursday, January 25. Space is limited, so be sure to RSVP soon. More information is on the leaflet inside the brochure that you were given tonight. And the second announcement is that the book, this marvelously weighty tome, is available for sale by our buddies from it's the bookstore actually, out front. And they're ready to take your money or your credit cards to exchange it. And Leslie will sign the books for you. There is also a reception tonight after this conversation. David, Leslie, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Michael. Well, Leslie, I just want to say, first of all, it's a great honor for me to be here with you and to see that my former student is doing so very, very well. So I want to just give you a little, you out there, just a little glimpse of the scope and the scale and the ambition of this book by reading you a few sentences from the introduction to Leslie's book, Troublemakers. And we've just heard a little bit of this from Michael Keller. She says, when 5 of the 6 most valuable companies on the planet are high-tech firms, 3 based in Silicon Valley, when the high-tech sector accounts for 9% of U.S. employment, 17% of gross domestic product, and 60% of U.S. exports, when 400 hours of video are uploaded to a single platform, YouTube, every minute, and more than 200 billion emails are sent every day, when the video game industry is larger than the movie business, and the biotech industry generates $325 billion in revenues in the United States alone, when United States manufacturing jobs continue to disappear, many of them lost to automation, when the electronics manufacturing and equipment industry spends almost $60 million on lobbying in a single year, when the sitting U.S. president guest edits an issue of Wired magazine devoted to the future of innovation, and his successor rides to victory through savvy use of online social networks, also blamed for disseminating misinformation, at a time when our relationship with technology is so intimate, as Michael just mentioned this, that 46% of Americans say they cannot live without their smartphones, and 1/3 of adults, talking about you here, say they would rather give up sex than their phones. So in light of all that, Leslie says it makes sense to ask how we got here. So that is the subject of this book, will be the subject of our conversation. At the conclusion of Leslie's book, she also mentioned something else that really caught my attention when she talked about the logo of Facebook in Menlo Park and how it is draped over or superimposed on the billboard, I guess it is, or billboard equivalent of what used to be Sun Microsystems. And you can still see the Sun Microsystems logo in the back of that frame or billboard. So it reminded me of something that I do in a class that I teach every spring here along with 4 other people. It's the most interdisciplinary course in America, we think. It's history, political science, literature, art, and civil and environmental engineering. 5 of us, 5 departments, 2 schools. And one of the units of the course that we focus on is the history of the West. And of course, not unnaturally, we conclude with Silicon Valley. And my last lecture, I show this little set of slides that I'm going to share with you. And you can see here better than I can, actually, some of the iconic pieces of architecture here in Silicon Valley. This is notional. I don't think this one's finished yet. I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay. So I show these to the students, and then I tell them a little story about how a few years ago I was visiting some relatives in upstate New York, Genesee County near Rochester. And I was biking down the towpath of the old Erie Canal. And I remind them, or tell them maybe for the first time in many cases, that the Erie Canal in the early 19th century was thought to be one of the great engineering marvels of the world. And what passed for high tech at that time, not a phrase that was in common usage, of course, would have been something like the Erie Canal. It became obsolete within years, not even decades after it was built, supplanted by the railroad. And of course, now the towpath is a recreational biking and hiking trail. So here I am biking down a trail of what was once upon a time the leading edge technological engineering marvel of the age. And I'm biking past what used to be this great industrial complex in Rochester, which in the post-World War II era was arguably, the immediate post-World War II era, a candidate to be called the most advanced technological city in America, home to Polaroid, Eastman Kodak, Xerox, and so on. And this is what it looks like today. This is a photo I took myself here. So these great industrial behemoths that were thought to be cutting edge and to give Rochester and that area resilience against any future recession or depression because they were so high tech and so energetic. Then I asked the students to contemplate what it might look like 100 years from now as a continuous fleet of self-driving vehicles move down a pathway once known as Highway 101. And the discrete language service is beaming into everybody's headsets as they go down the road. And it's bidding them please to look eastward as they're headed south towards San Jose and remark on these great industrial hulks that once were home to Google and Facebook and Intel and so on. And of course, my students absolutely said, absolutely not. We live in a time of eternal and eternally benign innovation, and nothing can ever stop this steamroller, which is just going to go on forever. So I say all that just by way of making the maybe self-evident point that everything has a history, including the history of high tech, and most historical eras do come to, if not a conclusion, at least a cadence. So I admire Leslie for approaching this subject historically. She trained in one of the very best history departments in the United States, of course. So the big question that I think animates this book and your prior book, Leslie, The Man Who Made the Microchip, is this jackpot question that everybody tries to tackle, none as ably as Leslie. Why did Silicon Valley take root in this particular place at the particular time that it did? And how deep are those roots, or how much farther into the future can we really see this trajectory, this arc of historical development going? So that's the big question, but let's just start maybe a little more modestly. After you wrote this marvelous book, The Man Who Made the Microchip, about Robert Noyce, what prompted you to go on and write a second book of this sort, and why did you write it in the form of a kind of collective biography of 7 different individuals? It has a cast of thousands, actually, but you focus on 7 principal people. So why that way, and what questions do you think you'd failed to answer adequately in your first book?
Super. So I can't believe I'm doing this to my dissertation advisor, but let me put that question on hold.
I'm used to it.
I just want to show you a little bit about Silicon Valley, what it looked like, and what the tech was like, and what the sort of political and cultural scene was like at the time in 1969. Plus, I am desperate to get that picture off the screen. I think this was David's vision of the future right there. But so what did the Valley look like in 1969? A lot like that. It was called the Valley of the Heart's Delight. This was a time of great transition for the Valley. So we had, on the one hand, orchards like these that were largely for stone fruits, apricots, plums, and they were there. I mean, one of the people in my book, who's actually sitting over here, her name is Fawn Alvarez Talbot. She was 12 years old when the book opens, and she is making her pocket money by picking plums in the bucolic hamlet of Cupertino, California. And the valley at the same time is already having a tech industry take root. So we have Hewlett-Packard's already 30 years old. The microchip companies are on their second generation from Fairchild to the so-called Fairchildren. Companies like Intel was all of a year old. AMD was not yet born. Silicon Valley still wasn't called Silicon Valley. And there was a time of incredible immigration to the valley. At this point, it was mostly people coming from elsewhere in the country, but the population of Silicon Valley tripled in 2 decades. From 1950 to 1970, it went from 300,000 people to 1 million people. And that's the equivalent of a new person moving into the valley every 15 minutes for 20 years straight. So they were generally young, they were generally well educated, and the valley was just poised to take off. The technical scene at the time, again, you have the sense of a place just on the cusp. At this point, we're still dealing mostly with microchip companies selling to users of microchips. It's very much of a kind of gearhead to gearhead world. In the next few years, you're going to see the birth of these industries that David and Mike were talking about. I mean, we're about to see the biotech industry be born. We're about to see personal computers take off, video games. The first ARPANET transmission, and the ARPANET eventually morphs into the internet, lands at SRI in 1969. This is a time of incredible ferment, just a few years away, but it's not quite there yet. And what you have yet at this point is a place where in the country as a whole, the world as a whole, like the notion of a computer was almost either completely abstract in that it was just sort of the machine that you heard about that the banks blamed when your checking account didn't balance right at the end of the month, or it was something like HAL from 2001: A Space Odyssey, which had come out in 1968. Either way, there was no way you could imagine ever wanting one of these things in your house, much less affording one of these things in your house, hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy a mini computer. So I thought, okay, what is the first possible instance I can find of a computer aimed at people's houses? Here you go. It is the Honeywell kitchen computer. This is from the Neiman Marcus catalog, 1969 Christmas catalog. There's so much to talk about in this, but I'm not going to do it. We can talk about things later, but I do want to tell you that this computer cost $10,600. That is the equivalent of about $70,000 today. This is sort of a starter Tesla that you're seeing on the screen. And the specs aren't listed, but I can guarantee you it is orders of magnitude less powerful than the $250 Nest thermostat that I would guess a number of people have on their walls. And it was, to sort of further reinforce to you how impractical this kind of computer was, the notion of a computer in your house, here's something else that was in the catalog at the same time that you could buy. Baby elephants. As a matter of fact, you could buy 2 baby elephants for the price of that kitchen computer. And they really would have been just as likely to show up in your house. My understanding is that none of these computers sold, despite having actually come with that beautiful floral apron that we saw in the picture. The last thing that I just want to set the tone for you on is the sort of political, cultural environment of the time. And anyone who was around then knows that if I say 1969, San Francisco Bay Area, you know what I'm talking about. This is what I'm talking about. This is an actual photograph from the protests at People's Park in Berkeley in May of 1969. Just as an aside, if you cut me, I do bleed cardinal red, but Berkeley has an underappreciated role in the launch of Silicon Valley. The core of the computer science lab at Xerox PARC came from basically the computer science department at Berkeley through a little bit of a roundabout way. Important early engineers at places like Ampex and Atari came out of Berkeley. We've got to give them some credit too. But the main reason that I wanted to show you this photograph was to give you a sense of the anger and the fury, the total animosity between sort of authority figures and the young people at this time. And I bring this up because it had very practical implications here in the Valley. Because what you had now were the experts, the leading edge experts in microelectronics, and especially in graphics, who would have at one point naturally funneled into a place like the Department of Defense, or to a major defense contractor, or to a university lab. And now there was much more of a sense of we're going to go our own way. And that had practical implications for who came to work at these companies. They were top-notch people. And the second thing that I wanted to point out is that this is the beginning of seeing very, very powerful technology. At this point, we're still talking about integrated circuits mostly, but we're just about to get to the microprocessor and everything that follows in its wake. In the hands of people who are saying, you know what, I'm going to forge my own path, I'm going to go my own way, the way we've done it before is not necessarily the way we're going to go now. And as we all know from paying attention to the world around us, this is a very real question that we're dealing with today. And I mean literally today. Actually, for those of you who feel like grabbing dinner on campus or really enjoying the reception after, you can stay until 7 o'clock, and there's actually going to be a talk at Cubberley. I wrote down the title because it was so completely relevant. What did Silicon Valley do to democracy and the media? And this is being discussed tonight at Cubberley at 7 p.m. It's a very valid question. Maybe we're going to get to it here too. But I do really feel that the roots of that question also have their origins during this time period. So to your question, David, what did I think was missing from that first book? What made me write a book with a huge cast of characters? I really feel that if ever anyone in the world deserved a biography of his own, it would be Robert Noyce, who's the subject of my first book. He was a remarkable man who, in addition to co-inventing the microchip, co-founding Fairchild, co-founding Intel, mentored people like Steve Jobs, led sort of the delegation that went to Washington, D.C. to argue for protection for the American semiconductor industry in the wake of Japanese competition. He was an incredibly important man who absolutely deserved a full biography. And at the time that I was writing it, I was struck by how many other people there were in the story who I wished I could talk about too, because I really feel that the analogy that I tend to use is that innovation is like a baseball game where the pitcher has thrown a perfect game. And anyone who's had the good fortune, unfortunately I'm not one of them, to see one of these games know that the reason a perfect game happens is that the catcher is making the perfect calls and the first baseman's stepping on the bag at exactly right, and the outfielders out there making these incredible catches. And all that goes into the record book is that the pitcher threw a perfect game. And that, I think, is a good metaphor for how we understand innovation, and it's not an accurate metaphor. There are people from all different parts of different companies, from all different companies. The academic research labs have been huge, all who contribute to this sort of innovation. And I really wanted to be able to tell the stories not just of the famous entrepreneurs, because Noyce was a Steve Jobs level celebrity and Elon Musk level celebrity in his own generation. But I wanted to be able to talk about the engineers who no one ever hears about, and the people who are just behind the scenes who are making this happen. And that's why I wanted to write this book.
How did you, this may be a very difficult question, or an unfair question even to ask.
Won't be the first time.
How did you land on these 7 principal figures? Were there others that you wished you could have included on that short list, or what?
Yeah, so I had 3 criteria. The people had to tell us something important about the Valley and its history. I wanted them to be largely unknown, and I wanted them to be genuinely fascinating stories in and of themselves. For fun, I tend to read a lot of fiction, and I really wanted these to be good stories with real narrative arcs that you could follow. Yeah, if, were there but world enough and time, sure, there are other people I would have included. In retrospect, I kind of wish that I'd had a way to put Bill Perry in this book. I think, I wish I'd done that because he would have enabled me to really talk about the government's role in Silicon Valley. I didn't do that. There were a few people who I tried, but they weren't interested. And I would say that I'm really pleased with where I ended up because I feel like we're covering manufacturing in the Valley, which is something that people don't really know about, engineering, the whole sort of what does it take to actually build a business? That's a huge question that I think is not sufficiently answered because it so often involves things that sound really boring, like supply chains and the sort of thing that people don't talk about, but actually made for surprisingly exciting reading. Cover the role of Stanford and particularly how ideas made it out of university labs and into the hands of the rest of us. And yeah, the birth of the internet, the connection between the birth of the internet and the personal computer industry, this isn't something that I'd known about at all. And I really traced through the career of a guy named Bob Taylor. So yeah, I'm pleased with where it ended up.
Well, as a reader, I am too. It's a great read, and you've certainly accomplished your goal of telling a lot of absolutely fabulous stories. And I agree with you as well that I think you actually used this phrase in the book, you didn't use it just now, that innovation, especially in our era and the kinds of technologies we were talking about, innovation is a team sport. And our cultural legacy memories of innovation as represented by people like Alexander Graham Bell or Thomas Edison or Luther Burbank, the lone inventor in his lab and so on, that's just hopelessly outdated. And I think this book makes the point really splendidly that it takes a lot of people. It's the technological equivalent of it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a lot of expertise, commitment, devotion, time, energy, creativity to actually get to first base. You mentioned Bill Perry, and that prompts me to ask you actually several questions about some of the major, you might say, ambient factors that fed into this phenomenal location of Silicon Valley here in Santa Clara and San Mateo counties, in the Bay Area generally. That's the federal government. You want to say a little something about the role of the federal government in nurturing this? Part of our mythology is that maybe we're not Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Edison anymore, but we are entrepreneurs and we do it on our own, and the government be damned. You want to say a little something about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important point, and especially important since I was talking about the sense of distrust of the government in the 1970s. And I don't think that it's too much of a stretch to say, it's not a stretch at all, to say that Silicon Valley exists because of the federal government, a necessary, not sufficient condition. So from the very beginning, I mean, I've already explained that the Department of Defense started the ARPANET, which became the internet. The federal government, in the form, again, of the Department of Defense, bought 100% of all of the original microchips that were made in Silicon Valley, because who else is going to pay for light and quick and reliable engineering with no caring about the cost. So the federal government was, in effect, served as the major venture capitalist in a lot of ways. I think, too, that there's been legislation that's passed that has been so favorable to the Valley going back a long ways. So if you look at the end of the 1970s, there was a change in, this is the sort of thing where when I first read about this, I thought, no, I don't want to write about this, but it's actually very interesting. There's a change in the ERISA laws about how pension funds can invest. And it used to be that you weren't allowed to invest as a pension fund in any sort of high-risk investment vehicle. Well, this meant that venture capitalists had almost no sources of money. Well, that law gets changed in the wake of lobbying from, among other places, Silicon Valley, and actually primarily from Silicon Valley. And all of a sudden, the pool of capital available to venture capitalists goes through the roof. It's a consent decree that both forces Bell Labs to license its transistor technology and IBM to unbundle hardware from software, which then led to the birth of the independent software industry. The federal government legislation is enacted what, at least from this perspective, looks like, well, I won't put a value judgment on it, 100% tariffs on Japanese imports of chips in the 1980s. And it just, it has been on and on and on. And I also think that something that we don't appreciate sufficiently is the extent to which anyone starting a company in the United States, full stop, is already starting on third base relative to most places where you can start a company in the world. I mean, well, I'm hoping this will continue. We have the rule of law. We have reliable sources of clean water, reliable electricity, and very, very basic things that we so take for granted that we don't even realize that these are the result of, government influence in our lives. So at the same time, I do think that this spirit of independent thinking that people claim for themselves proudly as sort of the mantle of the entrepreneurial mind is also true. I think that it is possible both that the role of the government has been insurmountably important, and also that attitude of I'm going to make this happen has been insurmountably important.
Nice balance.
There you go. Well, this is how I scraped through my oral exams with him.
You also mentioned Stanford, and here we sit. And certainly a big part of our on-campus, I'm going to say mythology, recognizing that some myths are in fact accurate, but part of our on-campus belief mythology is that Stanford spawned Silicon Valley, or midwifed it. It could not possibly have taken root any other place, and we had a direct responsibility for this. And indeed, one of your principal characters in the book is Niels Reimers, who, of course, ran the Office of Technology Licensing here, and certainly a major player in your book and in this whole picture. But do you want to give us again one of your classically balanced assessments of just how much responsibility should be assigned to Stanford for this development?
A lot of credit goes to Stanford. I mean, Stanford was very early under the guidance of Frederick Terman to recognize that there could be a sort of mutually reinforcing relationship between the university and the surrounding community. This notion of building what is now called Stanford Research Park was in direct response to, I mean, it's hard to imagine now, but a brain drain of technical talent away from this place during World War II and immediately after. Stanford really led the way in patenting innovations to come out of university labs to benefit the university and also the inventors. This is, what David was referring to is Niels Reimers' work at the Office of Technology Licensing here at Stanford. When he started that office in 1970, in the previous 13 years, Stanford had earned $3,000 total from all of the inventions from the faculty, staff, and students at the university. Within a year of the establishment of that office, the university had earned $55,000, and now that number, which includes, for example, Stanford's stake in Google, which was due to the algorithm having been developed here, actually under a federal contract, and also the recombinant DNA patent, which I talk about a lot in the book, which sort of led to the birth of the biotech industry, stakes in companies like VMware. At this point, the Office of Technology Licensing has brought $2 billion into Stanford, almost, and really the effect on the population, the student population as a whole, in understanding Stanford as a place where innovation happens has been really real. But one of the things that is an ongoing theme in this book is how much pushback these people got almost every step of the way while they were doing this work. So recombinant DNA was a really easy target. I mean, if you look in the book at some point, you'll see I think it's 1977, it's a meeting of the National Academy of Sciences, and recombinant DNA has just sort of been announced, and people are terrified that this means that we're literally going to have monsters that are created by combining DNA of different species. And I mean, like literally the mayor of Cambridge, Massachusetts asked if, that there had been recent reports of an orange-eyed monster, and could this be due to recombinant DNA at Harvard? But at this meeting of the National Academy of Sciences, there were protesters who unfurled a sign, and it said, "We shall create the perfect human race, Adolf Hitler, 1933. So there was just the pushback was incredible, and even Niels Reimers, in deciding to do this was not a straightforward decision. There were real concerns about, will an Office of Technology Licensing somehow undermine the fundamental mission of a university to promote the growth of knowledge throughout the world by requiring people to pay for it? And there was a lot of discussion that had to happen around universities don't pay for licenses, research institutions don't pay for licenses. So there was so much to think about. Would the university turn and start favoring research that they knew were going to generate valuable patents? There's been even the stuff that now we look back, we think, wow, that was such an easy decision. Of course they should have done it. No, I mean, when you're in the middle of it, none of these decisions are easy. And anytime you're kind of breaking through with new ideas, it's scary. It's scary to you. I mean, the number of people who I talked to who just said, this was the worst time of my life. A very stimulating, exciting time, but I mean, Bob Swanson was so stressed out when he started Genentech that he checked himself into the hospital. He said he felt like the stress was chewing on his heart. Mike Markkula, who's owned a third of Apple with Jobs and Wozniak, and almost no one knows his name, even though he is the person who sort of leveraged their genius into the youngest company ever to make it into the Fortune 500, and he did it by pulling in the previous generation of semiconductor, basically middle managers. If you look at Apple's IPO statement in 1980, their S1, the chairman, the president, the VP of manufacturing, VP of marketing, VP of sales, VP of HR, general counsel, their major outside investors, Regis McKenna, who was their outside PR and marketing guy, who incidentally introduced the entire world to personal computers and biotech. All of those people came from the semiconductor industry, all of them. They were all microchip people. We think of Apple as being sort of sui generis, but in fact, Apple was built solidly on the foundation that was laid by the previous generation of entrepreneurs. And this is actually why Steve Jobs said what he said that Mike quoted earlier about the importance of understanding the history. He talked about later in his actually commencement address here, he talks about how there's a baton that gets passed in Silicon Valley from one generation to the next to the next. And so all of this time was so exciting and so stressful. You know, Mike Markle said that this was some of the hardest times of his entire life. So we look back now in the same way that we kind of look back. It drives me crazy when people will say to me things like, oh, everyone on this book, it's not true, actually. I have 2 women in this book. But if they look at old Silicon Valley pictures, they'll say, well, everyone in those pictures is, you know, an old white guy. And I feel like, these were the rebels. I mean, these were the people who were pushing the limits. I mean, you can't just, because they ended up on the other side having these decisions, most of them turned out to be the right decisions. You can't forget how hard they were. It was a really tough and exciting time.
Let me tell a brief story by way of asking you another question. This is a story about a conversation. I've heard this story. I wasn't a witness to the conversation between Kuan Yew, the premier of Singapore, and Xi Jinping. And it was in the last days of Kuan Yew's life and the early days of Xi Jinping's leadership in China. And the story goes that Xi Jinping said to Kuan Yew, you know, China has 1.2 billion people, and we can recruit our next generation of innovators, scientists, engineers, performers, artists, creative people from 1.2 billion people. And anybody who thinks about taking us on should understand that that's a challenge, that we have that big talent pool to draw on. To which, so we're told, Kuan Yew replied, that may be true, Mr. Xi, but the United States of America, unless it loses its way, can draw on a talent pool of 7.5 billion people. In other words, the whole planet's population, because of immigration. So there's the backstop to the story. So you want to talk a little bit maybe about the role of immigration in fueling and feeding this thing we call Silicon Valley?
Absolutely. If anyone asks me sort of what is the secret to Silicon Valley's success, I always say that baton pass. Because to me, the most interesting question about Silicon Valley is not why did Silicon Valley happen here, but why is Silicon Valley still happening? I mean, there have been so many regions that have built up around a certain technology, a certain innovation and such, and then they die or they fade. But Silicon Valley, it's just been sort of like from chips to all the personal computing and all of the consumer tech and then to networking and then, you know, now we're in the cloud and mobile and social, and it's just sort of been like, so why does that happen? And the answer to me has always been, 1, that baton pass that I was talking about, and 2, immigration. Because as I said, when I opened with the population tripling in 20 years, there's been a constant inflow of people to this area. I mean, those of us who live here sometimes be like, oh, it's so crowded, you know, which, by the way, has been a complaint since the 70s. You go back and they're like, it's too expensive, it's too crowded, it's too polluted. But it's just been a vital role because the immigrants to this area, first from the rest of the United States and now from all over the world, have served as this vital refresh in the system to just have the ability to attract the best and brightest people from all over the world is astonishing. And I mean, the numbers absolutely bear it out. At this point, more than half of the unicorn companies, which are the privately held companies with valuations of $1 billion or more than half of those companies have a founder or co-founder who was born outside of the United States. And at this point, 2/3 of the people who work in tech in the Valley, 2/3 of the men, 76% of the women between the ages of 25 and 44 who work in tech in the Valley were born outside of the United States. So you can say, I can say absolutely definitively, no immigrants, no Silicon Valley, full stop. There are things that we need to figure out better. I think that some of the criticisms around the way that the H-1B visas have been used are legitimate criticisms that we need to figure out how to address. Nonetheless, the broader point about the role of immigrants is 100% dead on.
So we're still talking here about the various factors that figure into some comprehensive explanation for the phenomenon of Silicon Valley. So we've talked about the federal government, we've talked about Stanford's presence here on the ground. We've talked about the changes thanks to ERISA that liberated a lot of capital that could be drawn in and focused for these purposes. Talked about immigration. Let's talk about maybe the squishiest one of these kinds of factors, but one that certainly preoccupies me as the founding director of the Bill Lane Center for the American West, which is incidentally co-sponsor of this event. But you'll hear it said frequently that the fact that Silicon Valley, California, is in the West, in some difficult to define cultural way actually was an ingredient in the sauce that made up Silicon Valley. And it's hard to imagine this happening in, pick your place, Florida or Pennsylvania or what have you. Is there anything to that at all, do you think?
Well, I mean, I'd also point out that Seattle is in the American West. So, I mean, that's another,
My
another
hometown.
data point. There you go. Yeah, so there's something to that, I think, and it is frustratingly
I think so too,
squishy.
but what is that something?
I don't know. So, you know, I tried to write a long paper about the relationship between the notion of pioneering and moving west and open space and the whole notion of creative destruction. And I think there's something to that, actually, that the notion that you move beyond existing barriers and you create something new. I think there's something to that. Person after person who I spoke to just talked about the wide open spaces of the West, which really aren't here anymore. I think something else that's important is, and actually something you taught me in thinking about the American West, is that it's not West for everybody who comes here, which is that, of course, people who are coming from Asia are coming east. And,
or El Norte.
Coming north. And so that's been kind of interesting. I've wondered if the whole pioneer metaphor, which I think is a very good metaphor, and I actually think is a much better metaphor than the disruption metaphor that we all hear all the time. I've wondered if one reason that it has faded somewhat is because that's not a metaphor that necessarily resonates with people from other places.
So let's do something that I tried to breed out of you when you were a graduate student.
Oh no, it's going to be the counterfactual?
Yes.
No!
So history is an empirical science, and we try to stick to the facts.
I can't believe you're doing
But here we are, we're in a different setting. So how about, let's just speculate a bit, or I'd like to ask you to speculate about some might-have-beens. What if X had been different? How would Y have consequentially been different? For example, what if William Shockley's mother had lived in Duluth?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what David's referring to is that William Shockley, the co-inventor of the transistor, came to set up his company here because his mom lived here. And Stanford very quickly tried to get into the act. This was he was about to win the Nobel Prize in physics and had not yet descended into the sort of eugenic thinking that really destroyed his reputation and his mind at the end of his life. And so, David, you're basically asking, I mean, Gordon Moore said the same thing to me. He's like, good thing Shockley's mom lived here. And I think there's some validity to that in that the transistor was this remarkable piece of technology, incredibly powerful and incredibly flexible. I mean, the way I think of it is like the tiny grain of sand inside the pearl. And everything in technological that has happened in Silicon Valley, there's a way in which you can just think of it as another layer of the pearl, where you're just adding more components, and then you're connecting them, and then you're building logic into it, and then you're sticking a keyboard and a screen on it, and then you're shrinking it down, and then you're connecting it to other things that have little grains of sand at their hearts, stringing them like a pearl, putting the pearl in the cloud, you know, all of this happening. And so I do think that the technology itself was really important, but I think that part of what was very special about it coming here, if you think back to that picture of the tree and the orchard, this place was in a really unusual situation in that it was still a very regional, a very rural economy that was deeply tied through transit, through just economy in general, to a very sophisticated economy, namely the post-war American economy. And what you had happen was this technology plops down at the same time that the area is starting to industrialize, and you get almost a custom-built ecosystem around it that developed, specialized supply houses and equipment manufacturers and things like attorneys who specialize in building startups and HR companies that specialize in recruiting people to startups. And this whole, Gordon Moore uses this analogy of shooting an arrow against the wall and then drawing a target around it with the arrow at the bullseye. And he says that's how you define a market. And Silicon Valley did somewhat the same thing. Plop goes the transistor, and they're like, oh, we'll just build a whole economy around this. So I think that worked really well so far. I did engage in a counterfactual in the book. I wondered if you were going to notice it, because there was a time in I think it was the mid-1970s, when the Department of Defense tried to sell the ARPANET. They tried to sell it to Xerox. That's how I learned about it. I was writing about Bob Taylor and going through some of his old letters, and there was a letter from his boss. And I should say those papers are now here at Stanford, actually, which will be a wonderful addition to our Silicon Valley archive. And as a matter of fact, if any of you have papers that you have wondered, would anyone ever care about my lab notebooks, my video recordings, the little notes that I took, the mail that I sent, or the email? Yes, we care. Please get in touch with me if you're interested in that. But one of the letters that was in Bob Taylor's notes in his papers was a note from Jerry Elkind with the subject, his boss, the subject line reading something like, should Xerox buy the ARPANET? And they tried to sell it. They tried to sell it to AT&T as well. And so I engaged in that sort of counterfactual. What would have happened if the ARPANET had become privatized in the early 1970s? And I think we would have a very different internet than we have today. It would have been much more restricted and just a much narrower sort of world for people to play in.
So there's that failed negotiation, and there's Shockley's mom. Are there any other places where what we might just call contingencies or accidents of history turned out to have enormous consequences that could easily have gone in some different direction, but for some random event that really didn't have any particular logic of its own? Is there anything else you care to identify like that?
Well, I mean, so to me, the role of serendipity is one of the reasons why Silicon Valley continues to be at the sort of heart of innovation in a lot of ways, even though, thanks in large measure to the inventions that have come out of Silicon Valley, we all know that we can virtually be anywhere at any time. And I think that serendipity just plays sort of an ongoing role now, in that I know of companies that exist because there were parents whose daughters ended up in the same class, and then they got to know each other, or they ran into each other at a religious ceremony, or at a restaurant, or so. This sort of, you see companies now trying to create this serendipity architecturally. The spaceship campus of Apple that we were seeing, the big donut-looking thing. In part, that's designed to encourage interaction of employees, from different parts. I mean, in my book, the first thing that really came to mind when you asked that about serendipity was when Mike Markkula retired from Intel at the age of 34, and decided after a while he was a little bored, and he would start to see entrepreneurs for the equivalent of office hours 1 day a week, because he just sort of missed that energy. And it happened that his good friend Don Valentine, another one of these semiconductor pioneers who started Sequoia Capital, actually under the umbrella of the Capital Group, which is something that I think a lot of people don't know. Sequoia Capital didn't start as an independent operation in the same way Kleiner Perkins did. It started as part of Capital Group and then spun out. But Don called Mike and said, look, there are these two guys in a garage. They're both named Steve. They could really use some help. And that is, what got him involved in Apple. And this was a time where if you didn't pick up your phone, people couldn't leave you a message. I mean, who knows? That could have gone a very different way.
So Leslie has graciously agreed to spend some time with us here answering questions. We have 4, or is it 6 mics out there? I see 4. So if you have questions, if you could please go to a microphone that's near you, and Leslie will be happy to try to respond to you. Let me urge you please to be concise, whether you're making a comment or asking a question, because I'm sure we're going to have many people who want to take voice, so the more concision, the better. Sir.
Yes, Paul Wessling. David, you asked about accidents of history, and Leslie, I want to stretch your, go back about 140 years to the state of California, which passed a law that said that non-compete clauses would be unenforceable in employment contracts. Mm-hmm. And if you worked in Massachusetts or New York and you left a company, you had to pump gas or shoe horses or something until the year was over and you could actually compete. Whereas in California, you can walk across the street, get a raise, and compete as long as you don't take the secrets. Can you comment a little bit on the state of California and that kind of maybe Wild West idea of not enforcing employment contract issues with non-compete clauses?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a good point, and this is yet another example of the way that legislation actually shapes the whole environment that we play in. I mean, I think that the importance of non-compete clauses has been pretty clearly established, and that it's been an important reason why we've been able to have the whole startup phenomenon happen as easily as we have. Yeah.
Gentleman in the rear.
Yeah, thank you.
One behind you. I'll give you next.
Yeah, because the industry here started largely with semiconductors and because there's a lot of manufacturing associated with it, I've heard many accounts that a lot of the founders didn't want to set up a plant in, say, New Jersey because of unions. They wanted to be able to set up manufacturing facilities where innovation could take place. They didn't have to deal with job descriptions, being defined and all that. So could you comment on the lack of union culture in California?
Yeah, I can certainly comment on it in Silicon Valley, and actually I think this is a really important point, which is that this used to be a manufacturing economy. Now Silicon Valley, more than half the investments in the Valley and in San Francisco go to software. And so now what you need to start a tech company is pretty much a laptop and an internet connection. Back then, there was, and obviously they're hardware companies now, but back then they were almost all hardware companies. And this meant that they had to build things. They built computers and they built them here, and they built microchips and they built them here, and they built advanced phone systems and they built them here. And there were factories, and this whole question of would these factories be unionized? This is something that I write about in the book. Silicon Valley never had a successful union drive at any of the companies that I looked at. The defense contractors had a few union shops. Most of them were extensions of sort of national shops in some capacity or another. And there were a couple reasons why unionization never really took root here. One is that these factories were almost always, I almost said manned by, employed women. And not only women, but women who were immigrants, and usually not even all immigrants from the same place. So this combination, those are three groups that often don't unionize. There were some deliberate efforts, particularly in the semiconductor industry. If there was rumor that there was going to be a union drive, everyone at all the semiconductor industries knew about it right away. Sorry, all the semiconductor companies. But something else that I think is really important and is easily lost in this age of we're going to deliver burritos by drone and we've just had a $25 million valuation of our company, is that there was a genuine idealism that drove a lot of these founders. And there was a real desire to make these companies a place that, I mean, the company Rome, had the slogan, "A great place to work." HP was very concerned that they actually have a great corporate culture. Ask, another company that I write about, a great corporate culture. Ask was a software company, but the point maintains. And it's just, they built companies where there was not a need for a union. I mean, if you look at Rome, all the employees, not just the ones at the top, all the employees, after 6 years of service, got 12 weeks of paid vacation. They could all buy stock at reduced prices. Now, the key employees also got options. But these manufacturing jobs were excellent jobs. People were able to buy houses. People were able to move out of manufacturing into other types of work. So it was a very different time and place.
Yes, sir.
Let me impolitely say that almost everything I heard you say is fake history. It would take me a couple of hours to refute it all, so I won't.
Concision, please.
What's that?
Concision, please.
Yes, that's what I'm attempting. I will instead just make a short brag. The 4 richest companies in the world, namely Apple, Alphabet, Microsoft, and Amazon, are all spin-offs from one laboratory here at Stanford called the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Lab, which I founded in 1965. The reason you never heard from me about me is I did not hire fake journalists to write bogus stories such as the ones you have absorbed. So I'm going to try to fix that, but that'll take some more.
All right. Thank you for that correction to the record. Ma'am.
Oh, thank you. We have learned much about women in tech, and there's very controversial issues around it now. And I know you do feature some women in your book. But my question is, when you look at this whole coming-of-age issues and the origin stories and the original culture, do you see the same issues back then, or the way it evolved then leading to some of the issues we have now?
That's a good question. And also just to address the previous speaker, it's absolutely right. This lab was called SAIL. It was very, very important. And actually, John Markoff, who's sitting over there in the corner, has written quite a lot about SAIL. And SAIL, it is also in the book. So yes, very important. Women in Silicon Valley. From the beginning, there have been women at these companies. There haven't been, there have been a lot of women on the manufacturing lines. There haven't been as many women in the sort of technical side of things as you would have hoped then, or you would hope now. At the same time, and one of the women that I profile is actually sitting right there, Sandy Kurtzig. She is the founder of Ask and the first woman to take a tech company public. There were women in the Valley at the time. People on the inside knew that these women were doing the jobs they were doing. There were game designers at Atari who were women. Not many. There was Susan Kerr on the Macintosh team at Apple. I mean, the fact that I have to call them out by name tells you that we weren't dealing with a huge swath of women. What persisted was the belief that Silicon Valley was part of the broader culture at the time. So these women were, the things that they had to deal with would curl your hair. One of the things that I was just shocked to see was an Atari newsletter in which there was a short story contributed by an employee this was in a company newsletter about a doctor who developed a machine to grow women's breasts. And this was a very explicit story published in a company newsletter. And the things that these women dealt with, you know, CEO of a company being asked to get coffee, being mistaken for a booth babe at trade shows, this was happening everywhere. And what we're seeing now in Silicon Valley is, unfortunately, has become abundantly clear, happens, you know, has happened everywhere. I think that the way that we're going to handle this best is by getting more women into the positions of power in these companies, and then we're going to be in better shape.
Thanks, Leslie. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you, by the way, Leslie and David, for putting this on. I think this is a great program, and I'm sure this could go on and on and on. One, I would ask, though, or question whether this ought to be required reading for students going into Stanford. Most of us here have white hair, and you know, and really younger people need to hear this. And my point is asking if you're looking at volume 2 of this, because the initial opening did mention something that I was involved in, very important, called networking. Now, you did mention local area networks. Without local area networks, we wouldn't have the social network explosion we have today. So, and even the iPhone, if you look, will automatically, it looks for a local area network first before it goes out to a carrier, a cellular carrier. Any plans to do the same kind of idea and cover networking in detail?
No plans, but I'm not writing it off. Yeah, it's a very valid point. And actually, David, you assigned something I wrote in that class, right? Which I think of as sort of like my brain dump of everything I can think of about Silicon Valley.
I think of that as a kind of précis summary of the central arguments in this book that we've assigned in our course on the West for the last several years. And thank you for writing that.
Yeah, thank you for asking me to.
Yes, sir.
So, Jeff Thompson.
I've read the synopsis and I've read a number of reviews, and I'm really looking forward to reading the book. Since somebody brought up SAIL, remember that the original SAIL building was part of a government lab from Sylvania that was financed by the government. And the original SAIL building was also the first segment of what was going to be the first circular building in Silicon Valley, which most people don't know. Comment I wanted to make was not everything was roses in those days. There were a lot of blooms, crashes, and burns. For example, the last company I worked for hired me for 90 days. I stayed 3.5 years. And when they crashed and burned, there was barely a ripple in the newspaper. And they wrote off $5 billion trying to be innovative in the communications world with satellites and communications for telephone and, if you will, satellite-based internet. So what was the impact of a lot of those companies that drew a lot of talent and then spread it out again after they crashed and burned? You have any comments about those kind of things?
Yeah, I mean, this has actually been a really interesting feature of Silicon Valley for a very long time. You have these sort of concentrations of incredible talent that sometimes really skyrocket, sometimes not, and then it's like a seed pod, and they explode, and they go and they pollinate the rest of the area. So Fairchild Semiconductor was one of these places. Xerox PARC was one of these places. PayPal, the famous PayPal mafia, was one of these places. And it's a very important part of the Valley's history. And it's funny because I've often wondered, if you were starting a company, would you want to be one of these companies? Because they end up blowing apart. But they get a lot done, and that really speaks to something else. Strangely, one of the things we've barely talked about in our conversation is the actual people in the book. And I promise you, the book is about the people. All of this is kind of woven in, and it's fat, but the last 100 pages are all notes. But I think that part of what these concentrations of power, of talent really speak to is the role sometimes of a single individual that acts as a magnet that sort of picks up talent and draws them from all over the place. So William Shockley, for all his faults, was one of these people, and then the 8 people who left sort of magnified that at Fairchild. At Xerox PARC, Bob Taylor was one of these people who drew people together. And I think that when you were sort of listening through, we talked about the government, we talked about culture, we talked about geography, we talked about technology. There is the element of really remarkable people who were here at the time, and definitely not everyone was a saint, and it was not all roses. That's 100% true. But I do think that it's important to recognize that these were some extraordinary people who would be the first to tell you that they got really lucky to be in the right place at the right time.
So we'll take these 2 last questions, and then I'm going to exercise my privilege of asking the very last question.
Well, my question may be a great capper. What do you think the proposed tax bill will do to the Silicon Valley economy by, in effect, destroying the home and mortgage deduction and the California state income tax deduction, and therefore raising the cost of doing business in Silicon Valley even more?
Go for it.
Yeah, thanks. This is the economic historian. I actually am going to punt on this a little bit by saying that the great advantage of being a historian is that you never have to predict the future.
That is our canonical cop-out, right
There you go. High five.
I'm going to do the same. I'm going to punt as well. Yes, ma'am.
My question will be a segue to the talk that's coming later tonight. But one of the ways Congress helped the internet develop was through the Communications Decency Act, giving internet platforms sort of a shield against publisher liability by saying they're essentially not responsible for the content, to grossly oversimplify. Is there anything in your book or in your research that you found that foreshadows what I'll just call sort of misuses of the internet that we're seeing today, and that will be the subject of tonight's talk later on?
I think that what you see a lot, my book really tracks the birth of the love affair between the government and Silicon Valley. I mean, this is when all of these industries put together their industry associations, the National Venture Capital Association, the Semiconductor Industry Association, start sending people to Washington. Regis McKenna, who I mentioned earlier, has the brilliant realization that these are incredibly complex technologies that can be made so much more approachable if you put the faces of individuals on them. So the tech industry was one of the first to go to Washington, D.C., sending their execs to testify directly as opposed to hiring outside. They had outside counsel, but they didn't do the testimony. And I think also to this question of sort of where we are today with the social media companies, and I mean the incredible power that people have come to realize they have, and the sense of the intimacy of our relationships with our technology. Something that's really struck me again and again in studying the history of technology here in the Valley is the extent to which you see one time and then the next and the next, people who are really just thinking they're doing something kind of for themselves start doing it, and the next thing they know, they are, I mean, literally, like 10 years after 8 guys leave to start their own company, they are able to make a plausible argument on the floor of Congress that they are an essential part of the American economy. And you've seen that with Facebook. You know, sort of someone starts, he wants a way to rate women as hot or not in his dorm room. And now there's like 3 billion people, I think, on Facebook now. And I think that something that has happened is that the Valley now is just playing on a scale and at a scope that is just completely unimaginable. It speaks to the power of the technologies that have been developed here, but they've kind of outrun us right now. And it's incumbent on all of us to help figure out where we want these guardrails to be.
Let me emphasize what Leslie just said, this book is about people, and it's about some fascinatingly colorful people and consequential people. And I can't urge you too strongly to leave this auditorium and put your hand on your wallet and go out in the back there and buy a copy, or buy copies, plural, for friends. So I can't ask you the question, who's your favorite person? That would not be a fair question, but let's bring it back by way of conclusion to technology. Of all the technological innovations that these people were connected with, that you've written about, which one do you think, if you had to nominate one as the single most consequential innovation, what would it be? Now, I'll throw some candidates into your hopper. Maybe none of them qualifies by your lights, but the graphical user interface, the transfer control protocol, the ARPANET itself. Maybe that's not the right list, but if there's one particular technology you think was more consequential than others, what would it be?
Yeah, the problem is that you just can keep reducing it back and back and back and back and back and back and back till you're back to the transistor.
For the wheel.
The wheel, yeah. I think for this era, I remember talking to Mike Markle about this book at some point, and he said, "Why, it's all just the long tail of the microprocessor." And I think there's a universe in which you could make that argument. But I think that what I would say this book really points to is, and this is a general term, but software. This, we're living in the era of software, and this book is charting, among other things, the rise of software and sort of foreshadowing its role in our lives.
It's a wonderful book. I'm very proud of you. Thank you for writing it. Thank you for all your interest.